Welcome to Space Uncensored, the podcast where we demystify space and uncover the untold stories behind the scenes. I'm Andrea, your host. And on this beautiful day, I'm super excited to welcome Alice Carruth. Alice's journey into new space economy is really fascinating, and she's here today with us to share it. She is an esteemed producer from groundbreaking T-minus Space Daily podcast, which literally makes her the mysterious woman behind the scenes, if I can say so. So, with a passion of unraveling the mysteries of cosmos, what really I like about the story of Alice is, how she carved a niche for herself in the world of space communication, because you would never think when she tells you what her background is, how she ended up in space. So through her vision, T-minus Space Daily podcast has become the go-to source for space enthusiasts and novices like myself, fostering a sense of wonder and discovery. With her finger on the pulse of a space exploration, she continues to elevate science communication to the new heights, inspiring a generation to look up and dreams beyond the stars. So please, after this recording, go and subscribe to T-minus Space Podcast, because I'm sure every episode you will learn plenty. So Alice, super warm welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me on as a guest. I really appreciate it.
So let's jump straight into it, right? So, you had quite a journey from media studies in London University of Westminster to television producer to podcast producer. Can you share with our audience a little bit the story? How did you become a producer of space, or how did you get where you are today?
Yeah, it has been a bit of a kind of roundabout way of getting into the space industry. So I started, as you mentioned, as a producer in news media back in London. And my career took me to the Middle East when Al Jazeera English started up. So I moved to Qatar when I was in my early 20s to pursue a career as a journalist, working in international relations. And I absolutely loved it. I was there for over 6 years. Or coming up to 6 years. And it was while I was over there that I met my husband, who works for the US government. And he took a position over at White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico. And I remember looking it up on a map thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do in the arse end of America? I apologize. I have lived here for a long time. And I'm telling you, it's not that bad. But looking it on the map, it was like all I could see was Juarez on there and thinking, what am I going to do here? And we moved here 11 years ago, and I took a couple of years off to stay at home with my kids. And then I decided to start freelancing again, just to sort of dip my toe back into the working arena. And about my second assignment, I got asked to do an interview on space with a company called Virgin Galactic that had just moved to southern New Mexico. And, being a typical journalist, I kind of really went into the background of why space here? Why is this here? And just found incredible information about this being the birthplace of the US space program, how much it's been involved in every single mission from the 1930s onwards, and was just blown away by it. So I met Jonathan Firth, who was the then executive vice president of Virgin Galactic, and he was setting up a space festival. And he said, would you be interested in coming and joining us and helping out? We could do with somebody with some media skills. I'd never done PR or marketing before, but, it was kind of a nice little flip to learn how to do that, or event management. So we started in 2018, the Las Cruces Space Festival. And I was doing that for about a year before a colleague came over and said, I invest in a company. They could also do with some space marketing. Would you be interested in doing that? So I started working for a space startup. And that was a really great steep learning curve of learning about LEO, learning about communications in low Earth orbit, because I was working for Solstar Space that does Wi-Fi in space. And I was there for about, again, a year to 18 months before a position came up at Spaceport America to do public relations. So I joined Spaceport America in 2020 as the world shut down. And I worked there for 2.5, 3 years before I was approached by N2K. So N2K does the Cyberwire. It's a very well-known, very established cybersecurity podcast, and they were really interested in trying to sort of spin off a vertical in space. And they said, you've got this interesting background of journalism and PR in space communications. Would you be interested in applying for the role? So I did. And we launched in April of 2023, and we're now up to 400 episodes in of the T Minus Space podcast. And it's been a fun little adventure, to say the least.
It's incredible. And before we go to the podcast itself, I think that what would be really fascinating to understand, you know, how you talked multiple times, PR about space, right? So for the listeners who are listening to this episode, who are working in PR or journalism, how different you would say? Is there any difference the way how you approach the work if you work with topics with the traditional topics in the journalism, and if you work with the topics which are related to the new space economy?
I've seen the argument both ways, and I definitely say that the fundamentals are the same when it comes to PR and marketing across the board. It doesn't matter what company you're working for, how you approach it is very similar. The one thing I would say about space marketing or space communications, is you do have to have quite an understanding of what it is you are communicating.
Mm.
You have to know a little bit of the jargon that's used in space, but you also have to be able to get the complex scenarios, whether it's technical, and it can be very, very technical, and you have to learn how to simplify it to be able to reach out to a larger audience. And that really is dependent on what company you're working for. Maybe your target audience is just B2B, so you don't have to worry about simplifying the language, and you can use a lot of technical jargon. But with PR, when you're working for a spaceport and you're supported by which Spaceport America was, funding by the taxpayers, I had to be able to communicate very complex scenarios to the masses, all different age groups, all different backgrounds, all sorts of different understandings of space. So that was definitely a fun journey of learning how to take very complex situations and try and simplify them to a larger audience. So yeah, I think anybody who's interested in space, and I do think that's quite key, you do have to have a passion and an interest in it,
Mm.
will certainly be able to transfer their skills over. There's always opportunities there for people.
So you almost took the next question out of my mouth. You said you have to have a passion for space, right? So when you were, a little girl, did you ever think about or dreaming becoming astronaut or work in the space, or did it come much later? Where did this, passion of yours come to fruition?
Not until in my 30s, which is terrible. I've sat on many panels now, and everybody says, I grew up wanting to be an astronaut. I grew up wanting to be an astronaut. I grew up wanting to be an astronaut. And I said, I grew up wanting to be a camera operator in a war zone. And everyone looks at me and they're like, what? I was like, yeah. I remember being 10 years old and watching Kate Adie on the TV back in my home country of England. She was a news correspondent for war zones. And I was like, I want to work with her. I didn't want to be in front of a camera. That was definitely not my path. I really wanted to be behind the scenes. And of course, I did that for years. And like I say, I kind of didn't know anything about space. I grew up in England, so space wasn't really something that people talked about as a career opportunity. I mean, I remember going to my career advisor when I was 15 years old and telling her that I wanted to work in a news reporting newsroom, and she told me to think a little bit more realistically and think about maybe going to work for the local newspaper. So it's funny, it just didn't happen for me that way. It's more of a transferable skill of I came in very slowly. This has been a slow progression. The Space Festival that I mentioned that I started to get involved in back in 2018 was a voluntary role. It still is a voluntary role. Even though I gave myself the fun title of executive director of it, I don't get paid to be able to do the festival. It's just something I enjoy. But it's been a really great learning experience working with people in the industry and a great networking experience. And I really think that's key with anybody working in the space industry is who you can reach
Mm.
out to, because not just for getting business opportunities, but for learning. I think mentoring with people in the space industry is really key. I've got some really great mentors I can turn to and say, can you explain this to me? And they're able to kind of go, take me under the wing and talk me through what it is that they've done or how to explain something further. And I think that's really key to anybody. So no, it definitely wasn't a passion for me growing up in England, but it is a passion for me now. And my husband will attest that I am such a collector of all things space. I am a firm space nerd now, but it did take me until my 30s until I actually discovered space for myself.
I like a couple of things which you said. One of it was obviously when you spoke about your mentors, right? As we grow in our careers, as we get older, sometimes people become mentors, but they don't necessarily use mentors. And I think it's interesting that because space is such a complex topic that, you mentioned you have mentors. So how did you choose your mentor or mentors?
It's
Or
it's
did they
kind of a
choose
case.
you?
Well, a bit of that actually. So, yeah, it's kind of been a case of who do I admire, what they're doing. I know you've spoken recently to Christina Korp, who I am a huge fan of, and I'm really pleased that I've worked with her very recently. But I've watched her career progress over the time, and she is very much somebody as an icon who is a great person you can reach out to as a mentor who will explain, hey, look, I came from a very non-STEM background. And I've learned this industry this way, and this is how I apply my skill set to it. So there's been a bit of me seeking out people like that, but certainly the people that I really trust, it's been a case of we've just worked together for a long time, and I've learned what they've got are their strengths, and hopefully they see that I have strengths to add to it too, and we kind of complement each other. So even though I am in my 40s now, I still think mentoring is a really key thing. So I try to give back, but I also look for other people that I can look up to. You'll certainly figure out in the space industry that not everybody knows everything. In fact, quite on the opposite, people kind of are in their little silos. There will be great subject matter experts in one area, but they might not know about the entire industry. So always find the right people that you can trust to reach out to. And there are a lot of people in the industry that are willing to put their time in to sort of say, hey, look, let's help you out here. If I don't know the answer to that, then I can introduce you to somebody who might know the answer better than myself. So I think it's really key to look out for mentors. And I think it's also really key to give back and be a mentor when you're able to. So I try to do that a little bit more. Although as a communicator, there is certainly a limit to how much I can do for mentoring others that are coming up through the industry.
I want to jump straight into your podcast, right? You are a producer. So you really as I said in the beginning, you are the magical woman in the background who makes it happen, what people listen to. Can you tell us a little bit more about the podcast itself? What is it about? Who were the coolest guests you had on? And why should people tune into it?
So the podcast is not really journalism. I have to really put that out as a caveat because I've been a journalist in a newsroom. We call ourselves more as like the meze or tapas of news. We
I
gather,
like
we're an
that. I never heard that.
yeah,
Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt
we
you.
kind
This is very
no,
cool. Meze
no.
or tapas of news. I will
Well, we
quote
say
you.
that
This is so cool.
we say that because Maria, who's our host, is a Greek American. My background is Hispanic, so I go for the tapa. She goes for the meze, and between the two of us, yeah, we call it the tidbits of the news. We are aggregators. We collect all of the headlines that we see around the world and put it together as a daily intel briefing, which is kind of based on the way that the military does it. So every single day, military people tend to come in and they get a briefing of exactly what's going on around their programming. Well, we kind of approach it in the same manner. What is going on in the space industry around the world? What are the headlines that we think are important? And we'll probably aim to get between 8 to 10 stories in each day. Sometimes we don't always get to every single story, and we'll add them in as additional reading sections as well. So within 10 minutes, you get the headlines every single day of what's happening in the world. It's not in depth. It's just a case of, oh, hey, today there's been a launch by SpaceX, which I know is a regular story that we tend to cover. But also there's some investment going on in Earth observation in Israel, or there is some movement with the latest licensing that's happened in Australia, or maybe Kenya has got a new spaceport that they're developing, and these are the information that's going on with that. And as I say, we always put our sources in so people can go and read further about all the information of stories that we mention as well, because I think that's key. Some people want to know more about some stories, and some people just want to know the headlines of what's happening. And then every single day we have a 10 to 15-minute chat with somebody from the space industry. And I really do that because like I mentioned before, people in the space industry tend to work in silos. They tend to be subject matter experts about that one area they work in, but they don't necessarily know about everything. So maybe you're a space wrench working on a spaceship, but you know nothing about policy. Or maybe
Mhm.
you happen to be somebody who's a space lawyer who knows nothing about this obscure part that's made for a tiny solar array panel that goes out into space. So I really try to get guests that I think are interesting, that are covering everything from sustainability, policy, law, engineering. But I also like to really weave in artists. I think it's really key to understand that the space industry is so much more than just the STEM pillar that we tend to base it on. There is that room for the artists as well. And that can be people that are working on marketing campaigns, but it can also be authors of science fiction. It could be literal artists, people that are working on creative spaces that bring in a whole new audience to the space industry. And so I give them those 10 minutes to talk about what it is they do, to again get people to sort of understand that the space industry is so much larger than what people realize.
I think it's really fascinating. You know, my kids watch, I'm sure you know it, it's Kurzgesagt. It's actually produced in English, but it's produced in Germany. And it is this animation which more focuses on history, facts, or biology or chemistry. But similarly, what you do is, you know, bringing together these short information bursts from different industries in a really nice and consumer manner. And you know, I really enjoy what you said, that you cover everything, that it's not only the space which naturally you would associate like engineering and astronauts and so on, but you cover all of these areas, which, you know, it's really fascinating. And I hope, I wish in the future these kind of podcasts like yours would be the first 10 minutes in schools which they would be playing to the students to inspire them, right? Instead of, you know, opening what they will be learning, just say, okay, 10 minutes, listen about what's happening in space, and who do we have today, and how can you think about space in a different manner. um, so I
I
think
can see that working with universities more than I can with younger students. But yeah, that's essentially what the aim is, to give them that little taste of what's happening.
You know, my so I was watching with my son the movie Fortitude, and which is obviously about Ben. He absolutely loved it. He's 14, so I think maybe from that age it would be good. Across all of these different guests, right? Who were some of your, you know, hero guests for your personality? You know, what experiences did you have, and who did you like the most?
Oh, that's a tough question. You know, we've spoken to probably over 300 people so far, which is incredible because some people have come on repeatedly. Personally, I've managed to interview quite a few amazing people. I got to interview Pam Melroy when I was at
Mm-hmm.
the AIA Ascend conference last year, and she was incredible and gracious with her time, and I really enjoyed that. But I think some of the most interesting guests are the ones that maybe are a little bit more obscure. We found this great story about the Apollo moon trees, which were the seeds that went up, I think it was on the Apollo 14 mission, that then came back down and were planted into seedlings and sent around the world. And NASA forgot to monitor where they went to. And so it's landed on this archivist's desk where he now has to track where all these Apollo moon trees ended up. And so we have this great story with him about how he's now tracking the Apollo moon trees ahead of the Artemis moon trees that are now being planted around the world. So that was a really great guest. I think that title was called Where Did the Moon Trees Go? So if anyone's interested in learning more about that story, it's a good one. I'd be remiss to say that Charles Bolden wasn't one of my favorite guests. He is incredible. He really broke the glass ceiling when it came to how he entered into the space industry and carved a path for himself, eventually leading NASA, which was just incredible. But his story about how he got into the military was really quite heartbreaking and amazing to hear his side of things. I think even some of the more recent astronauts were definitely quite inspiring as well. Keisha Williams, who went up with her daughter on the Virgin Galactic flight, talked about, you know, the first mother-daughter flight to space. How as soon as she got to apogee, her first thought was, "I just want to check and see how my daughter's doing." It was a really relatable story. If anyone who's a mother, particularly myself and Maria, who run the space podcast, we're both mothers ourselves, and we found that really very relatable to hear a mum saying, you know, before I wanted to look out the window and experience microgravity, I wanted to make sure she was okay. That was my first priority. And even more recently, we spoke to Carson Kitchen, who was the youngest woman to go to the Kármán line. She flew a Blue
Mm-hmm.
Origin. her story is really quite incredible, and how she's then using that experience to try and help encourage others into the space industry who aren't from a traditional STEM background is really inspiring. But we've spoken to even people that you wouldn't expect to be part of the space industry. I spoke to the founder of Portals, which are the huge art installations around the world where you can go and connect with people from across the globe. So I think there's one in New York and there was one in Dublin for a long time, and it made headlines. They're now bringing in a live feed from SEN, which is the camera on board the ISS. So you can stand at these
Mm.
enormous portals and be transported to space.
Into
And
SS. Mm.
yeah, really interesting to hear that. And, I think he's from Lithuania. So it was nice to hear from somebody who's not from a traditional space background or even a traditional art background, who's done this incredible global experience that's now incorporating space, and how he hopes to achieve the overview effect with these portals around the world. Those are the stories that I think really resonate and stay with me from all the guests that we've spoken to.
I'm sure everybody who's listening already was, now on their computers or on their phones. If not by now, I think that I believe it's super important to go and Google your podcast. Uh, uh, you mentioned multiple different industries, right? Which brings me to the next question. The new space economy is projected to reach about 1.4 trillion, and many say, this is such a little. It's so little, it should be much more than that. But from your perspective and for the experience interviewing all of these different people from the different sectors, where do you see the greatest opportunities for corporations to engage in this economy? Do you have any sectors in mind where you think that they would be really ripe to grow and they don't see it yet?
Absolutely. I feel like the phrase "every company is a space company" probably more is probably more relevant now than ever before. In addition to the T minus space podcast, we also produce the AWS in Orbit podcast for Amazon Web Services Aerospace and Satellite Department. And with that, we were able to have a conversation with the World Bank, and they work with Earth observation to be able to assess developments in developing countries and developing nations. So they're able to use Earth observation to assess where transportation requirements are needed, where infrastructure is needed to support developing nations, which used to be done on the ground, boots on the ground, sending people in would take months, if not years, to assess these large, vast areas. And now they're able to do it in a very, very short space of time. And stories like that really give me hope on how we can use space for the better. And one of the other areas that I always come across that I think is fascinating is how much space is used in agriculture around the world. That we
True.
covered the story of Degas, which is a Japanese firm that's working with farmers in Africa to look at how they can help support the farming culture in Africa. So they're able to do things like monitoring crop yield, monitoring soil, figuring out obviously weather and when's the best time to harvest. It's incredible to see how companies are able to use Earth observation to be able to develop things on the ground. And then, of course, they're using GPS to figure out how to get themselves around their farms as well. So space is really starting to weave its way into everything. I read this great statistic somewhere, and I wish I could find it again, but I believe that the average person uses satellites 22 times a day. And when you think about it, how much financial transactions now use satellites? Every time you're putting
Correct.
gas into your car, you're using a satellite. How many times you're using your cell phone to look up your weather data or connect somewhere in a remote region, all through satellites. People just don't realize how much satellites are playing part in our every single day life. So I can see more and more industries moving in that way. I was even watching the Formula One over the weekend in Brazil and seeing AWS going around there. And of course, they're figuring out GPS and weather data and everything for the cars on the ground. So you're seeing it in sports now, which is incredible to think about it. So I see so much potential. And there are some really great companies out there that I'd encourage the non-traditional space companies to look to and say, how can I use space to enhance what it is I'm doing here terrestrially? Because they will figure out ways you probably don't even think about how we can
Yes.
use Earth observation, space-based communication, and so much more to develop things on the ground. And the other area that I really think is fascinating right now is the biopharmaceutical industry. And you
Mm.
look at companies like Redwire that are sending up incredible experiments to the International Space Stations where they're developing things like a meniscus, a 3D printed meniscus in space. That's just going to change everything for all of us back here on planet Earth. And revolutionize things that we just didn't even think about. So companies that I see that are working in that biopharmaceutical area are definitely another really interesting area. And I'm hoping to see more and more of that, where people are starting to think, okay, chips in space, manufacturing in space, biopharmaceutical in space. It's going to change everything for us Earthlings, us people here on planet Earth.
That's and I agree with you. I like, the topics when you spoke about the agriculture. One of the areas with when you combine obviously satellite imagery with IoT, this is such an incredible technology. For example, for validation of carbon credits, solar credits, or water credits, because you have no way how to, even from as water, because you can obviously manage what is the cubic meters, how is it clean, is it dirty, because the satellites is today the quality is so high. Plus, if you combine it with multiple other mechanisms and get the data out of it, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I like your example about the health, because that's groundbreaking. And of course, as we hope to start to put fueling stations into the orbit, and we will be able to go beyond where we are today and start to do some mining, so that we stop obviously damaging our planet, and start to maybe bring some minerals from somewhere else. So yeah, but what is quite interesting is that there is still kind of barrier for many companies, to even see space as an opportunity, right? Across even the industries, there are these outliers, and there are not too many. There are still very little. What do you think is, the reason why, for example, a bank or a fashion designer or a traditional agriculture, that they're not thinking about it? Is it, yeah, what do you think are some of the key barriers?
I still think it comes down to a lack of understanding of the space industry. I remember being in Maine last year. They started their Maine 2030 conference, and they asked me to come up to talk about how spaceports support economic development in the region. And they had protesters out front, and they were like, "Oh no, what do we do?" And I said, "Well, what are they protesting? What do they represent?" And it turned out that they were people from the fishing community, and there were people concerned about climate change. And I was like, "Oh, well, that's pretty simple. Where do they get their information from?" They hadn't even thought about the fact that the fishing companies use GPS on their ships, and they use weather data from satellites, or that we monitor climate multiple times around the day from satellites. So when you explain it to them that actually space isn't against the Earth, space is for the Earth, I think people start to get it a little bit more. And I think the barriers will start to break down when people have a better understanding of what potentially is out there. And space is also traditionally a very expensive industry to get involved in. And I'll put that with a big but, thanks to companies like SpaceX that are now increasing the cadence, means that they're driving pricing down to be able to take payloads up. It's actually a really affordable thing now to send a payload to space. I never thought I'd ever say that in my lifetime, but it really is. And people where traditionally they were doing suborbital testing because it was so expensive to go to orbit. They wanted to validate and make sure everything was correct before they went to orbital launches. People are almost skipping that whole side of the industry and just going, do you know what? It's cheaper just to send it straight up on the SpaceX cargo resupply mission, or a SpaceX multi-mission, to be able to start sending payloads into space. So I think people are going to start to see that cost barrier break down, and seeing it more accessible to a wider industry. So I think it's okay. Again, it's that lack of education, and it's the cost, and it's balancing the two of them. And I think it's really a responsibility of everybody working in the space industry to do a better job of educating the general public about why space is beneficial to them. That's beyond just us space communicators. It really is everybody's job to be able to do that. And I think if we all took the time to explain it a little better, more people would understand it. There'd be less opposition, and hopefully then more people would start to think about how they could use space to benefit themselves and those around them.
I really like, the work you're doing, and obviously, in the United States, there is so much of push towards space economy, and I come from Czech Republic, so obviously, in many countries in Europe, it's very limiting, right? You really have to grow up dreaming to be in space, and have that passion. How do you consider taking your podcast and obviously today with AI and with instant translation to start to maybe bringing the episodes in Arabic or Hindu or Czech. I mean, we are not a big audience, but because ultimately today it was very costly in the past, right, to have translations or notes, but today with AI it is so simple. What are some of your thoughts to actually bring the incredible work which you're doing into different parts of the world which don't necessarily speak English?
I think that's a really important point. Space is so global nowadays. I think those of us in America are very good at explaining how great the space economy is here. But one of the things that I really focused on, and certainly when I took up this job as producing the T Minus Space Daily podcast, was I wanted to show the global economy. I wanted to represent my home nation of the UK and my home continent of Europe. But I also wanted to tell the story of what's going on in India and what's going on in Japan and even what's going on in China. You don't have to get political to say, actually, they're doing a lot of great things over there as well. We should
Exactly.
be looking at everybody. And, as a humanity, that's the one great thing. We should always be thinking about how we can be more inclusive, especially when it comes to the space industry, because the more we bring people in from different backgrounds and different nations, the better the economy is going to be, because you never know what they're going to be able to contribute. We all come from different
Mm.
backgrounds. We have different ideas. We all have different ways of problem solving. And I think that's really important and really key to be able to develop the space industry around the world. And I would love to look at how we could start thinking about bringing it to an international audience in their language. At the moment, we already have over 30% of our audience from outside of the US. I will caveat that with about 10% of them are from the UK, but I know already we're reaching people in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, across Africa. So I get all of those statistics come in. So there are a lot of people that listen to our podcast or watch us on the YouTube channel as well that aren't native English speakers. So I'd love to be able to speak to them about how we can sort of help them learn a little bit more and put it into their language. And yeah, maybe AI is the answer to that. I think that could be quite incredible. But my one thing is, I do think you need to have a human voice added to it. I've listened to many a podcast now that is AI generated, and it just grates on you. You want to be able to
Um,
relate to whoever's telling you that story. That's the
yes.
one key thing about narrative telling, is really having that human voice added to it. And that's where Maria Varmaz, is our presenter, does an incredible job. She's very human, she's very relatable, and people like to speak to her.
Mm.
So I do think if we translate it, I'd love to be able to then see how we could get voiceover artists or communicators, journalists in those nations to be able to present the channel as well. So that's certainly an idea for the future.
I think, today I was on a conference 2 weeks ago, and they had AI translation into 70 languages, which was
Wow.
pretty awesome, right? And yes, the voices are not, obviously, because we breathe, we have a very different intonation, but the technology is getting better and better. And maybe Maria could have a digital twin in multiple different languages. So, that it actually speaks with her tone of voice, but it speaks Czech, for example, or it speaks
Yeah.
Mandarin, or it speaks Spanish, or French or Arabic, right? Because these are big audiences. So I'm really looking forward to it. I want to stay a little bit on the technology part because it's so fast, and you mentioned that how your podcast operate, you aggregate the news, which is really great, right? You have a part which tells you, okay, this are the top news, and this is the 10-minute kind of hero speaker, which brings you some content across. How do you embrace today's technology? We mentioned AI. How are you embracing it, and do you see as it as a competition that people will then use AI for getting their news, or or is it do you see it as augmenting yourself, so make it faster, easier for you, or how do you embrace the technology?
I've tried a few times to use AI to aggregate the news for me, and they miss a lot of stories because they're nuanced. At the moment, it's not quite there yet, but we do use it to write our social media. It just is a great little tool to be able to quickly pull things together without me having to think too much. But even then, I still make sure I copy edit because there's still some little things that kind of slide through the system. I think it's going to be an enabler. I've always believed that. When people start to see AI as an opposition, I think they don't understand it. It's a bit of a fear factor. It's a bit like the internet when that first came out, people were concerned. Of course, there's a dark side to the internet. There's going to be a dark side to AI. However, it is going to make things more accessible. And I love the idea of somebody taking my podcast and putting it through a translation tool and being able to understand it in their native language a little easier. And I love the idea of students being able to use it to be able to understand things better in their language and their vocabulary. So I don't see it as an opposition or a competition. I don't think it's there yet to be able to replace humans. I've not seen evidence of that yet. N2K, my parent company, does use AI a lot when it comes to the way that they write things out. But it's always going to be a human involved in that right now. Maybe 10 years down the line, it might do it all generated for me and have my voice and Maria's voice already in there doing it all. That would be wonderful. If I continue to earn a wage with it and it doesn't take away my role, I will happily embrace it. But you never know. Who knows? I certainly see it as a huge tool for space. I was recently talking to a company that uses AI next gen for their Earth observation, and they're able to now, rather than getting thousands of images of clouds, AI automatically stops the cameras from taking images where you can't see the Earth. And it saves
Right.
ridiculous amounts of data transmission. It saves the company having to have someone literally clicking through every single one saying, not useful, not useful, not useful. So there are definitely things like that where you can help develop things and enable things that we won't want to see in the future, like wasted data, which is such a huge thing, and it's a cost saver, it's a human time saver, and it could potentially be a lifesaver when you're using Earth observation for things like wildfire or flooding, for
Very
disaster
true.
relief, anything. So it definitely is going to be embraced in the future in the industry and throughout the industry, and I can certainly see us utilizing it more and more as we move forward.
I think that I am personally excited to hear your podcast in other languages because, as said, I'm from a small country where uh, majority of people do not speak English. Many of them speak German or other languages, and there are many countries like that. Obviously, in Europe, you are obviously from that part of the world as well. So how can you bring all this incredible work to children and adults in other places? I want to move into your more personal interest now, and do you have any favorite podcasts or resources which you turn into for your inspiration and industry updates?
Yeah, I don't have so many for the space industry. There are some incredible ones out there. There aren't any that do the news aggregation like we do, but there are some great long form chats. Like I really like Miko. I think Mika does a great job with long form conversations. Casual Space by Beth Mund is a really great one as well. So there's definitely, and my friend Daniel Fox and his Future of Space podcast. I actually got to guest host his podcast for his 100th episode to celebrate that. So there are some really great long form space podcasts out there. But not so many with the space news. I found a lot of those are AI generated and they're just reading the headlines that have come from elsewhere. So they're not such a great thing. But I just genuinely love podcasting. My background, as I mentioned before, is a lot in broadcast television, but I actually started in radio when I was a teenager. And I think radio is just an incredible medium. I listen to the radio all the time. I get all my information from NPR over here. I used to listen to it in the UK all the time. Um, I just think it's a really great way of forming relationships and understanding things. You can almost learn by osmosis in a great manner. And so when I'm going through podcasts, I often think about a subject I want to learn about, and I really use it as an educational tool. So for a woman, I go through like mother resources, podcasts that talk about how parenting has changed and adapted over the years. As an expat, I started off following the Two Fat Expats podcast. That's how I really got into podcasting. And they've got a whole community online now where people are exchanging ideas on that. I can sometimes dip into the really commercial ones as well. Joe Rogan does an incredible job. There's a reason why Joe Rogan is the biggest podcast in the world. He can get some really great guests on there. I might skip through all the political ones, but he had a guest on talking about Um, Up in Alaska, they found all these tusks from woolly mammoths years ago, and I found all that sort of historical context really fascinating. I love a good history podcast, anything where they can go into a bit more detail about it. It's a great learning tool. Um, and I also try and follow a lot of sports podcasts. My husband's a huge fan of sports, so I try and keep up to date. And Rebecca Lowe, who's one of my favourite sports journalists, has just started a new one with Gary Neville. So I've just started to follow their soccer. It's called Soccer Not Football, or Football Not Soccer. I can't think what the title is called, but it's a great little podcast to listen to. It's a fun tool. And again, that's a nice little easy digestible. I have to say, I do prefer the shorter ones. Now, I work from home, so I'm not on long commutes anymore. It used to be when I do a long commute, I'll download a load of podcasts and I'll drive somewhere. So I drove to Albuquerque a couple of weeks ago. It's about 3.5 hours from my house. And I had a series of podcasts to listen to that just played the whole way through. But at home, I'm constantly working and doing things. So anything that's like around that 20-minute mark is a really great way of me. Okay, I
Mm,
can do my chores, I can do my laundry, I can cook the dinner,
right.
and I can listen to something, and it's a nice, easy, digestible thing. And that's how I approach my podcast. I think of it as
Mm,
somebody who used to work in the industry at spaceports and at startups, and commuted a short distance. So I want to get my information in a quick manner. I want to be able to get to A to B in 20 minutes and get most of my podcast in that time. So all my podcasts, I try and aim to have around that
that's a great
22
feedback. Maybe
minute
I
mark.
should consider that too.
Hey, like everyone's different and it depends on what it is you're looking for. Some people really like long form podcasts. Some people like to
Mm,
drive and listen to them. So it really depends on who you're trying to reach as your audience. But yeah, I was trying to aim it as we'd never done this before. No one's ever done a news aggregate podcast in space before. So I was thinking, as somebody who used to work in the industry, how would I have
mm.
consumed a podcast? And that's how I approached it. So I'm always open to feedback, though. If people want it shorter, longer, whatever it is, please do tell us. That's the one thing I'm always learning. And I hope other people will understand that when they listen.
Talking about learning, in the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned obviously that doing something in space really requires you to go deeper and understand the topic. And today, more than ever, and obviously you are a great testimony with your news, there is constantly something happening in the space
Yeah.
industry, right? And new space economy. How much time on a daily basis do you dedicate to, obviously, I call it, take your brain to the brain gym and learn something new and go deeper in the topics. So besides of the obviously curating the news, how do you make sure that you yourself as a professional and individual, you have obviously broader view and go deeper every single day into the new topics?
I'd say majority of my day is exactly that. So I get
Mm,
up every day and start at 6 a.m. because I work East Coast time, and even though I'm based in the middle of America, and I spend about 2 hours reading through the news stories and deciding what I think is important or not. And I'm always learning. I really do think it's important to always be open to learning. There are certain things that I thought I knew and I'm finding out different. It's the great thing about anything to do with science. It's always changing. So I think it's really important for anybody in the industry actually to always keep abreast of what's happening. And there are some great resources out there, some really great, not just news resources, companies like NASAspaceflight.com, which do a lot of the live streams of all the different launches around the world, particularly here in the US, have really started to think about doing educational videos as well about how they
mm,
can explain why things are approached the way they are, why you're seeing this um, uh, gas release before a launch, and then they've started to dip into policy as well. So I do think trying to keep abreast of all the different things that are going on is so key, particularly in the way that innovation is moving, the speed it is. And I do think going to a lot of events is really important as well for learning. So when I go to Space Symposium or an AIAA event, or I'm trying to think what else I've done this year. We've been all over the place. Every time I go to one of these events, I'm always trying to learn. I'm always saying, what is it you're doing? What is it your information? And then it's the same when we approach our interviews. I genuinely want to know about people's, not just their background, but what it is they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it. Because it's about
mm.
problem solving often with the space industry. Why do you think that's a problem? Why are you looking to solve that problem? What's it going to have as an effect? And you'll find a lot of the technology that's been developed in space actually works for both off the earth and for the earth.
And
There's a lot of dual
exactly.
purpose.
Mm. You mentioned that you are a mother, so and you work, and you are a producer of a podcast which requires your daily attention. Can you share? I don't want to use the word balance because balance somehow doesn't exist. I think it's like a juggling.
No,
How do you make sure that you take care of? You spoke about the intake of the content, right? About your brain. How do you take care of your mental and physical well-being as well to obviously be able to, be there every day?
I think it's really important to be able to switch off from one or the other. So I work from home, but I work between the hours of 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. I'm in my office. So even if my kids are at home, they know they can't just come in here and ask me to take them out or do anything. I very much approach this is my daily job. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is 5 p.m. Eastern time, that's when I click off every day. And that's when I switch my mum brain on and try and be present for my kids. And that's part of the reason why I love this role is because I'm able to do those really great flexible hours. And I think it's key to be present when I'm with them. So I try my best to not be on my phone too much, which I fail at miserably. And my husband's probably listening to this right now, laughing away because the amount of times that I'm on my phone scrolling at nighttime, he's always like, "What are you on social media for now?" I'm like, "I'm not. I'm reading this story, or I'm looking for this, or I was just interested in that I found." Because it is difficult to switch off when you're supposed to be ahead of the curve and understanding everything that's going on in the industry. So I kind of sneak time. Like if my husband's watching something I don't want to watch, I will go on my phone and I'll start reading or doing things, and I'm always learning. But I do try my best to be as present as possible with my children, particularly. I think it's really key. They're still very young. My son's 9, my daughter's 12. They need mummy to be mummy when I can be. And it's difficult. It really is difficult. I was a journalist in the Middle East, working in a newsroom when my daughter was born. And I thought I could do it all, but you can't. It's a really tough thing. And I certainly, every time I keep seeing these reports coming out about attracting women in the space industry and worse, retaining them, I still think the issue is when we become mothers, it's really difficult to
Mm.
have a full-time job and be a mum. And you're right, finding balance is almost impossible. So you'll find a lot of women will really want to be in the workplace, but get pulled in the opposite direction, or they don't have a supportive workplace. And actually, you'll find a mum that is well supported by work, understanding that they have to be a mum sometimes before they are in that job. You'll retain them better. Whereas if you expect them to turn up every single day and this child is sick somewhere else with somebody else, you're not going to retain them. So it's really difficult. And that's the another great thing about the company I work for. I don't have set holiday dates. That's really rare for the US, because my
Mm.
company
This
understands that
is yes.
actually, yeah, you need to be flexible, and sometimes you might need to take more time, sometimes you don't. And they think that having more time off is actually really healthy, particularly for your mental health. And you mentioned mental and physical health. I've had my days where I got very, very, very stressed and I nearly burnt myself out. I find meditation is really key. It's not
Mm.
going to work for everybody, but for me, that's my time to sit, remember to breathe, switch off my brain, particularly when I go to bed at night. I don't want to be thinking and overthinking things at that point. And physically, I try and do as much physical as I can. I sit behind a desk all day, every day, or listening to podcasts. But that's when I get a good opportunity to go for a walk, or to do some yoga, some stretching, or I actually ran for a run yesterday for the first time in years. My body's paying for it today. But I do think getting physical is actually really important for both mental and physical health, because you have to be able to switch off during those times.
Right.
And I think that's really, really key. And it's never going to be perfect. That's the other thing I think we mums are terrible at. We expect women to be perfect all the
Yes,
time. Don't
that's
think
true.
you have to be perfect. Just turn up, be present
You
with your
know,
kids is really important.
you mentioned obviously your children, and you are in such an interesting area. They must be super chuffed that their moms works in the space, right? How do you empower your children in their interest, particularly in the science and technology?
Yeah, I think mum's not really that cool. I don't think mums are ever cool. So I was really lucky when I worked at the spaceport. I got to take my kids with me a lot to a lot of launches. So they've been exposed to incredible things. I think I told you a story once about how Richard Branson, before his flight, decided he wanted to engage with students from the local area. It happened to be that his flight was in July. The schools were out, and so Virgin Galactic were like, "We want some school children there." So as a local, my kids in school, I sent my daughter and her class to go and watch Richard Branson fly to space. So she and her friends got to high five Richard before he got into his car and drive down the runway to get onto the spaceship, which I think was just an incredible experience. I think it was lost on her. She was 8. So it probably went straight over her head at the time, which is a shame. Um, but they were there for the first then human space flight in New Mexico, so they got to witness that. They've been out to the Spaceport America Cup, which is the largest student rocket competition. We've taken them over to White Sands, where my husband works, to watch some launches there. I think they are starting to see more than anything how accessible the space industry is. They get to see that mummy's friends work at NASA, mummy's friends work at all these really cool things, and they could possibly do that too. And I also do my best to try and give back to their friends. So I go in and do STEM outreach in schools and explain to people about why space is important. You don't have to be a STEM person to be able to explain that. I think anybody could go in and say, hey, look, we use satellites 22 times a day, and list exactly what you're using them through, to get students to understand how important space is. And students tend to get it really easily. They don't need reminding that we live on a planet. The amount of
Mm.
adults I've had to remind people, actually, we live in space. So space is important to us because we
Yes.
are part of it. It's quite amazing. So I don't know, mummy's never probably going to be that cool to them because I'm mummy. But hopefully by osmosis, they'll recognize that they've got opportunities that could be anything. And that's the one thing I try and push for them as a parent, is to empower them to think that they can do anything they want to do. I would never have thought as a girl growing up in rural England that I was going to end up being a podcast producer in space, that I got to go and see people go to the ISS. I was there for the Crew 9 launch. I got invited for that by NASA. It's just incredible to think that I have all this stuff that's gone on in my life. I never would have thought I'd get to that. So I want to empower them to think, even if they don't want to get involved in the space industry, that they can pretty much do anything. And it's just a case of working hard, putting in the effort, turning up. And I do make a point of saying that to the kids. It's actually really important that mummy turns
Mm.
up and I'm present when I go to these things. So when I'm out at an event covering things, I have to switch the phone off. I'll say, look, I'll call you during these times, but when I'm here 9 to 5, mummy's got to not be mummy and actually go and be who I am as my day job. And they get that. So I think seeing working mums actually quite good for them to hopefully see that you can have a good balance of both. It's not easy and it's not difficult. And I keep saying it's definitely not perfect. But I hope that it inspires them as they grow up to be whatever they want to be.
I really like what you said as you were talking about the engagement. You said that many adults don't realize that we also live in space. It's actually a really profound statement, because I think that people think that space is something out there, but they don't
Mhm.
realize that actually we are part of space. We are just, a small little planet, which is a part of this massive universe. So I really like it. I cannot believe we are almost 1 hour in. So I have a last question for you. So you mentioned, how important is it to obviously constantly educate yourself and have mentors. And so I assume that there's kind of like a big community, and in the community is essential. How do you stay connected with the other people in your field? Because you also mentioned that many are obviously experts in their individual areas. So what is the role which community plays in the development in the development of the space economy?
I'd say it's central. You only have to go to any space event, whether it's Space Symposium, IAC, wherever it is you go to around the world, and you'll see how key it is to network and meet people and find out. And in between those actual real life events, which I do think are very key, it's LinkedIn. I do think having social media is really key, but having that
Mm.
networking event on social media that's not about politics or any of the other minutiae going on in your life, it's purely focused on the industry, I think is really good. And, I follow tons of different companies across various social media platforms. And I try and stay connected. I will always reach out to people and say, hey, how can I help? Obviously, I run a space event as well here in town every year. And I try my best to keep abreast of what's going on around all the companies in the industry. So I'm part of the Global Spaceport Alliance. I do think companies like that or organizations like that are really key. I've just joined the Space Valley Foundation, which is running out here in New Mexico, which is another great networking opportunity. So there are some really great organizations like that, New Space Nexus, that are umbrella organizations for the industry, AIAA, ASA, which is the Aerospace States Association here in the US. If you don't have that in your country or your region, I'd absolutely recommend it, because a lot of these organizations, even here in the US, have subsidiaries elsewhere. They have
You know,
organizations elsewhere.
the audience might ask themselves, can people who are just interested in space also join this organization, or do you need to
Yeah.
be kind of in the space economy to be able to join?
No, I actually think anybody can join a lot of these organizations. Reach out to them, ask questions, even if they don't have that opportunity. Maybe they know somebody else that does. I know AIAA has a lot of different organizations around the world that people get involved in. They don't necessarily have to have that as a background. A lot of astronomical societies around the world are another really great way of getting in. Start thinking about how you can get connected with your local STEM outreach centers or STEAM outreach centers. Anything. I really think it's key to get yourself known out there. That's the only way you're really going to develop and learn, is by networking with others in the industry. And there are so many opportunities. And I recommend anybody to go and reach out. Oh, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll see how I can connect you with the right people wherever it is you're for. Because, I think that's another thing that people think is a barrier, is asking questions of the people that are working in the industry. And I encourage anybody, if you're interested, just reach out to somebody. You never know what's the worst they can say. No, thank you. At least
Exactly.
you've
Yeah.
tried.
Yes. Exactly, I agree with you. So, Alice, this is amazing. This is it was such a captivating conversation with you. I love your energy, and I love your story. How from somebody who worked for Al Jazeera in Middle East, is a podcast producer on space topics and space aggregation, and I think that you are really demonstration of that you don't need to come from space. You don't need to grow up dreaming about being in space, but you still can play such a pivotal role of bringing the space knowledge to the audience. And I do hope that you will soon utilize some new technology and bring your podcast into other languages, so many others can benefit from the fantastic work you're doing. So thank you very much for being with me today and giving me that hour of your time. I'm sure that the audience enjoyed it the same way I did.
Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Okay, dear listeners, remember, stay curious, keep reaching for the stars. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. I will provide all the links to the podcast which Alice is producing, and all the other recommendations which she mentioned as well in today's episode, so you can follow up. And please follow also Alice and the podcast on their social media and listen in. Thank you very much, and see you at the next episode.